What's happening, friends? My name is Brian Almon, and this is What's Happening Gem State, a new production of What's Happening Idaho. This program will take a deeper look at some of the political stories and issues that are important to the Treasure Valley and to Idaho. Before we get started onto the main topic today, I'd like to shout out our very first sponsor. At J&O Realty, Keller Williams Realty Boise, they understand that buying or selling a home is more than just a transaction. It's a life-changing experience. Their philosophy is simple. Clients come first. And they pledge to be in constant communication with their clients, keeping them fully informed throughout the entire buying or selling process. They believe that if you're not left with an amazing experience, then they've not done their job. They don't measure success through achievements or awards, but through the satisfaction of their clients. With 10 years of experience, Cassandra Henry is your Idaho Realty girl. You can contact her at 208-982-0013. That's 208-982-0013, or visit her at idahorealtygirl.com. It's no secret that I don't really like the term rhino. I feel it's become overused in the past few years, as conservatives apply the word to basically any Republican politician that they disagree with. I think it cheapens the word. It's become as meaningless as when the left calls us racist. If my representative voted to raise taxes, well, he's a rhino. She voted against this bill that I really like, well, she's a rhino. He didn't use the exact words that I want to hear. What a rhino. You know, the Republican Party has stood for many principles throughout the years. The primary planks of the very first Republican platform in 1854 were to stop the spread of slavery and of polygamy in the territories. You know, as an aside, the Republican Party was founded on stopping slavery and preserving traditional marriage, so 1 out of 2 ain't bad, right? At the turn of the 20th century, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt adopted many of the populist policies that the Democrats had previously championed under firebrand candidate William Jennings Bryan. Teddy Roosevelt was known as a trust buster, using the power of government to break up big railroad, big oil, big steel, and all those monopolies that had arisen in the latter half of the 19th century. For Republicans who grew up in the shadow of Ronald Reagan, this almost seems heretical. Using government to interfere with business? Well, I dare you to call Teddy Roosevelt a rhino to his face. The Republican Party in the first half of the 20th century was much more isolationist than they became at the 21st. Idaho's own Senator William Borah led an epic filibuster against Woodrow Wilson's plan to join the League of Nations at the conclusion of World War I, and was still admonishing us to stay out of World War II until the day he died. Senator Bob Taft fought against the push for America to become the world's policeman after World War II in the early days of the Cold War. Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of World War II, campaigned on a platform of getting us out of the Korean War. Those attitudes were once normal in the GOP, but during the global war on terror, they would have gotten you called a rhino, or even worse, an unpatriotic traitor. Thankfully, the party is returning to a much more America-first perspective ever since Donald Trump. Many of the debates we have today that provoke accusations of rhinohood have been going on within the Republican Party for decades. There's always been this tension between the more conservative wing of the party and the more liberal or moderate wing. A friend of mine likes to remind me that elephants don't have wings, so if you're watching, you know who you are. Bob Taft and Thomas Dewey led those two sides in the 40s and 50s. Barry Goldwater and Nelson Rockefeller did the same thing in the 60s. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush united the two sides in spectacular fashion in the 80s. We see some of the same dividing lines in our party today, both at the national level and here in Idaho. We're in the middle of a realignment of the sort that happens every generation or so. Candidates such as Blake Masters and Kerry Lake of Arizona, J.D. Vance of Ohio, and Joe Kent of Washington are running on a vision that's very much at odds with old guard leadership like Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, and Mitt Romney. All that is to say that as someone who likes to try and understand history, I don't really like to use the term rhino. It ignores the many years of debate that we've had within the Republican Party about our principles and values. And we have to be careful with purity spirals, continually demanding that every political figure reflect our exact views at any given time, because eventually we'll just have a constituency of one. That said, if a current or former Republican officeholder makes a show of endorsing a Democrat candidate, one who stands against every principle that Republicans once claimed to hold, then I think the term is appropriate. You've all heard about the 50-odd so-called Republicans who endorsed Democrat Attorney General candidate Tom Arkush this month. It's a who's who list of who's? Has-beens whose names carry very little weight, if any at all. Raul Labrador, his conservative Republican opponent, likes to say that they're the ghosts and ghouls of politics past coming out at Halloween to scare the voters. For someone like me, who only moved to Idaho just over 4 years ago, many of the names on that list are entirely unfamiliar, and so they don't carry any weight at all. Some of them, though, are no surprise. Is anyone shocked that Patty Ann Lodge has come out of the closet as a supporter of Democrats? The worst part of this farce is how this gaggle of has-beens are using the R word to lend credence to their support for a far-left Democrat. It reminds me of the good old days when Rush Limbaugh was on the radio, and adversarial callers would play this game where they said, "I'm a lifelong Republican, but this year's candidate is too extreme, so I'm going to vote Democrat." The great L. Rushbo would treat them with the mockery they deserved. The same thing is happening here. Many of these ex-Republicans might have had an R by their name, but this endorsement calls into question their entire record. It certainly shows them in a new light, doesn't it? Fred Martin, who not only endorsed Arkush, but also his own district's Democrat candidate, used his power as Senate Health and Welfare Chairman to block several health freedom bills. Now that he's come out of the closet, we can look back on those actions and ask if he ever had conservative principles to begin with. Same thing with Patty Ann Lodge, who chaired the Senate State Affairs Committee. Former Ada County Sheriff Gary Rainey is another unsurprising name on that list. I wrote about Rainey many months ago in the early days of my Substack. You see, Rainey was the founder of a political action committee called Defend and Protect Idaho that created a Facebook page called Idahoans Against Extremism. The purpose of this PAC and this page was to attack Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin's campaign for governor during the Republican primary. They tied this tenuous string from McGeachin's videotaped address to the America First Political Action Conference to a shootout with violent militia members in the 1990s. The game that Rainey and his PAC played last spring is the same game the left likes to play with us. They'll come to us and demand we denounce some extremist on the right, insinuating that if we don't, then we'll be tarred with the same brush. In the case of McGeachin, they demanded she disavow the folks at AFPAC, the edgy young activists like Nick Fuentes and Andrew Torba, and when she refused, they tried to get other Republicans to denounce McGeachin, with the implication that they would be next on the chopping block if they too refused. The same thing happened to conservative commentator Michelle Malkin. Some leftist busybodies discovered that she had spoken at American Renaissance's annual conference, and they sought to cancel her. Even Airbnb canceled her, suspending not only her account, but her family's as well. To his credit, Ada County GOP Chairman Victor Miller refused to give in to the mob and went ahead with his planned dinner featuring Malkin last February, and it was a great event. So you see that Gary Rainey, despite calling himself a Republican, uses left-wing tactics to attack his political opponents. Was there ever anything conservative about the former sheriff? He opposed constitutional carry, lining up with the left who feared rivers of blood if law-abiding men and women were allowed to carry concealed without permits, rather than the conservative sheriffs who trusted their citizens with their God-given constitutional right to self-defense. In fact, Rainey opposed the Republican legislature when they attempted to preempt then-President Obama's plans for gun control. During the COVID lockdown, Rainey aligned himself with the leftists who called for ever more restrictive mask and vaccine mandates. He called the January 6th protesters terrorists. The question is, was Gary Rainey ever really a Republican? The same question goes for Fred Martin, Patty Ann Lodge, Lori Otter, and everyone else who endorsed Tom Arkush. The deeper question is, who else is a leftist in Republican clothing, who has yet to come out of the political closet? The accusation of extremism, lobbed not only by Gary Rainey, but many of the so-called Republicans who endorsed Tom Marcouche, is another leftist tactic. Consider that the Democratic Party has been speeding leftward at breakneck speed for the past 30 years, but they still turn around and point to Republicans, some of whom haven't moved, many of whom have slowly inched their way leftwards themselves, and call them extremists. They call us extremists for not wanting to allow preborn babies to be torn apart in the womb. They call us extremists for believing that male and female are separate biological realities. They call us extremists for having the same view of marriage that has existed for 2,000 years of Western history. They call us extremists because we believe that people should be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. On the other hand, what do the Democrats stand for? Deliberately exposing children to pornography and then encouraging them to get their genitals mutilated. Teaching children to hate themselves, their parents, and their heritage because of their skin color. Encouraging mass violence, arson, and even murder in the name of their political goals. Censoring speech that goes against not only their left-wing values, but against the falsehoods that are promoted by the regime. So I ask, who is really extreme here? The American left is extreme by its very nature. They are the descendants of Hitler's brown shirts, Mao's red guards, and Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge. Make no mistake, it is the left that is truly extreme. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking that your own conservative views are in any way radical or unprecedented. Don't let them make you feel ashamed of your ideals or the legacy of your ancestors. Don't let them call you a fascist because you hold to the traditional values of your grandparents who fought the fascists, Nazis, and communists alike. When so-called Republicans like Gary Rainey adopt this language of calling their opponents extremists, it's reasonable to assume that they are leftists themselves. They portray themselves as principled moderates in the middle, as if that is such a thing. In reality, they're just leftists who aren't quite as radical as the outspoken socialists. They've adopted the left-wing frame of reference, their worldview that says that history is naturally progressive, and that we're moving from an old, stale, regressive, conservative past into a diverse, inclusionary, progressive future. They are the first to throw their ancestors under the bus for being racist and sexist. They're the first to jump when the left demands they disavow someone to their right. And they fight enemies to their right with much more verve and vigor than they have for those on the left. They believe that the left is politically legitimate, but the right is not. They'll sit down with socialists, transgender activists, and race baiters, claiming to find common ground for compromise, but they refuse to have anything to do with anyone more conservative than they are. They will expel Patrick Buchanan and Sam Francis from the movement, while welcoming leftists like Bill Maher and Naomi Wolf. They act as the gatekeepers of the conservative movement, taking it upon themselves to define the bounds of acceptable conservatism, while continually lopping off the rightmost branch of the tree. So, the elephant in the room then, so to speak, is where do you draw the line between liberal Republicans and Republicans in name only? I think there is an issue of party loyalty that comes into play here. Obviously, as voters, every citizen has the right to vote for whom they choose. Your ballot is your business. There is no law, nor should there be, that says registered Republicans have to vote for every Republican on the November ballot. But there is a difference between privately voting and publicly endorsing, especially for people who have built their careers on the party. Republicans gave Fred Martin so much support over the years. They donated money, they knocked on doors for him, they made phone calls for him, they wrote letters to the editor. They gave of themselves so that Martin could gain power and influence and supposedly be their representative in the state Senate. In return, he was supposed to be a champion of Republican values: small government, low taxes, a respect for life, traditional beliefs. When Representative Cody Galloway called him out, saying that he'd strayed from those values and needed to be replaced, she must have struck a chord with District 15's Republican voters because she won the primary by a lot more than people expected. Rather than taking his chastening like a man, rather than reflecting on whether voters might have a point and maybe he has abandoned his first principles, Fred Martin turned around and endorsed the Democrat. It really shows that for him, it was never really about principles. It was never about values. It was about personal power, using the infrastructure of the party to aggrandize himself and then throwing it away the moment it stopped fulfilling that purpose. Now, politics is a dirty game. Curtis Yarvin called voting a war, where two armies line up, but instead of shooting each other, they simply take a head count. The stakes are no less real than a shooting war, however. If you believe your opponents are the next Hitler, then wouldn't you do anything to stop them? Would you cheat to stop the next Hitler? That explains the motivation of the leftist true believers, at least. However, these supposed moderates have convinced themselves that anyone to their right is basically Nazis, racists, white supremacists, extremists, and believe that stopping us is more important than party loyalty. Ironically, it is these people who most loudly preach party unity when conservatives express their frustration with the more moderate or liberal Republicans. The GOP primary last May was incredibly contentious. Nearly every state office was contested between a so-called establishment candidate and a conservative insurgent. When the votes were counted, the establishment was victorious in every race except one. Raul Labrador solidly defeated incumbent Attorney General Lawrence Wasden. The Idaho Republican Party chairman Tom Luna held a unity rally on the Capitol steps with all the victorious candidates. The message of July's Idaho GOP convention was also one of unity. Even though the party leadership races were very contentious and nasty texts and emails were circulating behind the scenes, the people on stage still preached that we are all in this together. Tom Luna's concession speech after his crushing defeat to new chair Dorothy Moon was very classy, and he called once again for party unity. So what is to be done when 50 Republicans endorse a left-wing Democrat? It's not like Tom Arkush is some sort of political moderate. He's outright stated that he will not defend state laws that he personally disagrees with, which is the hallmark of the progressive state officials who are backed by activists like George Soros. So what are these 50 former Republicans thinking by endorsing such a man? I know the other elephant in the room. This room is very crowded, actually. It's full of elephants. Are independent candidates Scott Cleveland and Ammon Bundy. Some Republican office holders and PCs have publicly endorsed them, and in doing so, they've drawn the ire of the party establishment. I am a PC myself, and while I have engaged with both Bundy and Cleveland and tried to fairly evaluate their campaigns, I've stopped short of officially endorsing them or campaigning for them because I believe that by signing up to run as a PC, I took on a responsibility to support the Republican Party. If only Fred Martin and Patty Ann Lodge also took their responsibilities so seriously. In any case, I would hope that the party leaders who are upset at the PC's campaigning for Ammon Bundy are as vehement in their condemnation of Republicans supporting Tom Arkush. When a supposedly prominent Republican unleashes his ire against the right wing of the party, but doesn't have anything to say about his own compatriots who are campaigning for Democrats, then I think some suspicion of his motives is warranted. It's one thing for Republicans to stick to their principles above party loyalty. Say what you will about Liz Cheney, but she's holding to her principles of never-ending war and refusing to allow a populist figure like Donald Trump to shut down the swamp that's enriched her family. But the Republicans who endorsed Arkush are going against the very principles they once claimed to have. Perhaps they were hiding their true beliefs all along. Or perhaps they have no strong principles outside of a Nietzschean will to power. But there's something else going on here. As I mentioned before, the two parties are realigning. And this is something that happens every generation or so. Democrats were once the party of literal white supremacy, but their northern faction eventually took control and courted blacks and other minorities through civil rights legislation and LBJ's Great Society. On the other hand, working-class white voters used to be a solid Democrat voting bloc, but began moving to the GOP under Reagan, and have nearly completed that journey under Trump. Before I go on, just a quick note about sponsorships. If you have a local business, I would love to shout it out here on What's Happening Gem State. Contact me at brian.almon@proton.me for the details. By the 2000s, the Republicans were the party of foreign wars and adventures, free trade, unfettered support for private enterprise, and a liberal immigration system. Bernie Sanders used to dismiss open borders as a right-wing Koch brothers proposal that was designed to undermine the American worker. Meanwhile, Democrats were supposedly anti-war, anti-corporations, and suspicious of things like Big Pharma. Something interesting happened in 2010. Republicans had been slaughtered in Congress in 2006. Some of you might be old enough to remember that "Drain the Swamp" was actually Nancy Pelosi's slogan that year. And, of course, the Democrats had won the White House with Barack Obama in 2008. They rammed Obamacare through Congress, and Obama's promise to end all the wars turned out to be false. Millions of people on both the left and right, they were outraged, and they felt that they'd been ignored by their government and their parties. Two opposite movements developed at about the same time: Occupy Wall Street on the left and the Tea Party on the right. The premise of Occupy Wall Street was that big corporations wielded too much power over our daily lives. The premise of the Tea Party was that the government had grown far too powerful. What if I told you that both were correct? The establishment of both parties immediately sought to co-opt these dangerous movements. Raul Labrador tells the story of being elected in 2010 as a Tea Party insurgent against the establishment of both the right and the left, only to get to Washington, D.C. and hear incoming House Speaker John Boehner say, "You made some promises in your campaign that you're not going to be able to keep in office." Yet the Tea Party movement somehow survived. Despite the GOP nominating Mitt Romney, corporations are people, my friend, in 2012, Texas Congressman Ron Paul ran a campaign on principles that didn't seem very Republican, but in hindsight shows that he was ahead of his time. The Ron Paul revolution, involving thousands of volunteers getting involved in party politics, laid the groundwork for the Trump phenomenon 4 years later. Trump represented a fusion of the best of the left and right. He discarded our unthinking support for endless wars, free trade, and open borders, and he brought a healthy skepticism to our support for big business. The left's insurgency was less successful. The left-wing anti-war movement fizzled once they were expected to protest our first black president, the one we've been waiting for, and so Obama actually expanded the global war on terror, using drones to assassinate numerous alleged terrorists. When Trump came on the scene, repudiating the Iraq War and promising to withdraw our troops from the Middle East, leftists reflexively opposed him. Today, the left marches in lockstep in support for endless war, whether it's in the Middle East, Ukraine, Taiwan, or wherever. Recently, the Congressional Progressive Caucus released a letter calling for a negotiation to end the war in Ukraine, only to rescind it and throw their staffers under the bus after getting pushback from their party leadership and the media. In 2022, the only real anti-war movement is on the right. Imagine saying that to a Republican in 2004. They might just call you a rhino. The suspicion on the left about big business was easily taken care of. Big corporations learned that all they had to do was make a few empty statements in support of Black Lives Matter, gay pride, or transgender rights, maybe toss a few $1 million to the grifters claiming to represent these groups, and the problem went away. Today, it's the left that worships corporations, while the right is justifiably suspicious. In the 2000s, questioning vaccines or Big Pharma outed you as a left-wing kook, maybe a rhino. But today, even leftists are afraid to question vaccines or masks for fear that they'll be mistaken for Republicans. The last gasp of Occupy came in 2016, when socialist Bernie Sanders ran for president. A lot of people think that he was on track to win the nomination, but it was stolen by Hillary Clinton. She was the preferred candidate of the new left-wing power structure, and rather than raising a stink about it, Bernie kissed the ring and supported the establishment. The fruit of these reversals ripened slowly but surely. Liz Cheney, whose family has been a power broker in Republican politics for nearly half a century, finds herself much more at home in the Democratic Party in the post-Trump era, and I expect she'll announce her disaffiliation with the GOP within the next year or two. On the other hand, Tulsi Gabbard, whose positions on many social issues are still left-wing, has discovered that her opposition to foreign wars and the Orwellian redefinition of language that the left has engaged in puts her more at home with the GOP instead. Realignments are normal. It happens. Texas Governor John Connally was a Democrat who was in the car with President Kennedy when he was shot, and he was actually injured in the shooting as well. He later worked alongside Richard Nixon and switched parties to the Republicans. Reagan himself was a Democrat in the 1940s, leaving because he saw how the specter of communism was infiltrating the party of Jefferson and Jackson. Just a quick note about our last sponsor today, and that would be me. You can find my work at gemstate.substack.com, where I try to write about 3 newsletters a week, more or less, about what is going on in the Treasure Valley, Idaho, and our country. I post the occasional live stream, and I also do video interviews with candidates and political figures. My content is free, and if you'd like to receive it right in your mailbox, you can subscribe there. If you'd want to support me directly, I have paid subscriptions available as well. I very much appreciate those who have done so, who have seen fit to share their hard-earned money with me, and I am preparing a special thank you as we speak. So go to gemstate.substack.com and subscribe today. One of the starkest divisions between left and right today is over the very nature of reality. Maybe I'm biased, but it really seems like the right is still living in the real world while the left is on another planet. What left-wing figure has not fallen for every single obvious lie? Michael Brown never said hands up, don't shoot, but they all believed him. Jussie Smollett was obviously not attacked by MAGA hat-wearing white supremacists on the streets of Chicago in the middle of the night in the middle of winter, but they all believed him. Nearly every high-profile hate crime, threatening letters, nooses, swastikas on synagogue doors, turn out to be false flags perpetrated by leftist activists who are frustrated that the supply of racism and hatred cannot meet their demand. Leftists demand we ignore biology and say that men and women are not real things. They've redefined the word democracy to mean Democrats winning, so if voters elect a Republican, then they shriek that democracy is under attack. They say that the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, returning the issue of abortion to the states, meant taking away women's rights, and that states like Idaho banning abortion mean forced birthing. Everyone remembers the surveillance state aspect of George Orwell's 1984, but the real threat that he warned about was how the left will always redefine language in pursuit of their own power. Consider the basic words that are now meaningless in this post-truth era: democracy, woman, insurrection, mostly peaceful, hate speech, racism. Orwell warned that an all-powerful government would be able to retroactively rewrite the past, changing newspapers and books to reflect whatever current reality they want. Consider how our government today, after 2 years of saying that the COVID vaccine would prevent you from getting sick and prevent you from transmitting the virus, is now saying we never said that. You can show these people documentation, screenshots, even video of saying the very same thing. But like John Fetterman in the debate about fracking, they just repeat with a straight face that they never said it. As I record this, Elon Musk has just taken over Twitter. By the time you're listening, it could be a free speech paradise again. Or perhaps the government will have figured out how to take him out. I hope it's the former. In any case, a few leftists have put together their own competing platform, Tribal Social. That's tribal with an E for some reason. They apparently preemptively banned Donald Trump on the platform, and they've come out and say they don't censor, they just remove hate speech and misinformation. And once again, they're redefining words. What this shows, though, about the nature of speech is that the left, because they don't operate in reality, they can't survive on an open platform where debate is allowed. They have to censor, because reality has a pesky way of asserting itself. That's why leftists who used to run Twitter would ban you for saying that Rachel Levine is really a man named Richard, because their delusions don't correspond to reality, and so reality itself must be censored. We tell our children the story of the emperor with no clothes to encourage them to speak the truth even in a world full of lies. In the story, the boy is lauded because he gives the rest of the people the courage to speak the truth. In the real world, that boy is going to be censored for hate speech and probably never seen again. Well, maybe that paradigm is finally shifting. Truth is truth, and it will always come out. Swords will be sharpened to prove that 2 + 2 = 4, as Chesterton said. As citizens, as political activists, and as voters, truth must always remain our highest principle. In a world of lies, be the man who speaks the truth. My name is Brian Almon, and this is What's Happening Gem State. I will see you next time.